It is March 15, 1943, and a British Army sergeant crouches behind a ruined cottage wall outside the small North African town of Gafsa. The desert sun beats down relentlessly. 300 meters away, a German Panzerkampfwagen IV tank rumbles across open ground, its thick armor apparently invulnerable. The crew inside believes themselves safe. They have survived countless anti-tank encounters, but the sergeant raises his rifle, steadies a peculiar hollow-nosed projectile in the barrel, and fires. The ammunition travels through the air at only 600 meters per second, hardly remarkable by the standards of 1943. When it strikes the tank's flank, something extraordinary happens. A jet of superheated copper shoots through the armor plate as though it were paper. Seconds later, the tank erupts in flames. The German crew never had time to react. This was not conventional ballistics at work. This was the shaped charge ammunition that would transform anti-tank warfare forever, turning the armored dominance of Panzer divisions into a vulnerability. For the first time, a soldier carrying little more than his rifle could penetrate the thickest armor ever forged. The age of the tank as an invulnerable weapon had ended. The development of shaped charge ammunition represents one of the most consequential technical innovations of the Second World War, yet it remains surprisingly obscure. It did not come from theoretical physics laboratories or elaborate tank design facilities. Instead, it emerged from a peculiar scientific principle that had been gathering dust in engineering textbooks for half a century, rediscovered by desperate military planners racing to find solutions to an impossible problem. The Allies had entered the war with virtually no effective anti-tank weapons. They faced an enemy whose tanks were growing thicker, faster, and more formidable with each passing month. Conventional bullets and conventional explosives bounced off German armor like hail off a roof. The situation was not merely concerning, it was existential. Without a way to kill tanks, no infantry could hold a defensive line. No attack could succeed against mechanized opposition. Britain, in particular, faced this challenge from 1940 onwards, when the German army swept across Europe and left the British military scrambling to develop technologies that did not yet exist. The shaped charge principle offered hope, but getting it to work, perfecting it, and manufacturing it in vast quantities would demand ingenuity, trial, sacrifice, and inspiration in equal measure. When the German Panzer divisions rolled into Poland in September 1939, the world discovered something that would reshape warfare for decades to come. The tank had become not merely a weapon, but the dominant weapon. The British Army possessed anti-tank guns, certainly, but these cumbersome-toed weapons operated at only 37 mm caliber. They could penetrate early German tank armor, but only at close range, and they required dedicated crews, ammunition, and forward positions that were difficult to establish when facing a mobile enemy. As the war progressed and Germany introduced the Panzer IV, the Panzer V Panther, and eventually the Tiger I with its fearsome 88 mm gun and sloped armor, the British anti-tank gun fell increasingly behind. By 1942, the 37 mm round was essentially useless against modern German tanks. Even the newer 6-pounder gun, which entered service in greater numbers, could only defeat medium tanks at very close quarters, and it was painfully vulnerable to German anti-tank fire because it required exposed, fixed positions. The real crisis, however, was at the infantry level. An infantryman faced with an armored vehicle had virtually no personal weapon against it. Hand grenades proved ineffective. They would not penetrate tank armor, and even anti-tank mines required the enemy to drive directly over them. Soldiers felt helpless, and rightly so. The German army's solution was to attach tank destroyers and assault guns to infantry formations, which worked well enough when the two arms were well coordinated. But the Germans did not always have enough such weapons to go around. The British problem was even more acute. They needed a cheap, portable, man-portable solution, a weapon that an individual soldier could carry and fire, something that could be produced in vast quantities without consuming critical manufacturing capacity. Estimates suggest that by 1942, German tanks were destroying British anti-tank guns at a rate of 3-to-1 in combat. The figures were devastating because the guns had to stay in fixed positions, broadcasting their presence to every enemy observer on the battlefield. Desperate times produce desperate measures. British military planners began considering options that would have seemed impossible even 2 years earlier. One solution came from an unexpected quarter, a principle of explosive engineering that had been documented in scientific literature since 1888, when an American chemist named Charles Munro observed something peculiar during explosives testing. When he detonated explosives in a lined cavity, the lining would collapse inward and accelerate, creating a narrow, concentrated jet of material that could punch through obstacles with astonishing force. The effect was documented, understood in theory, but never actually weaponized in any practical sense. Engineers and researchers knew about it, but nobody had bothered to develop it into a practical weapon. Now, facing the growing threat of German armor, British weapons designers dusted off the old papers and began asking themselves the crucial question: could this principle be turned into something that would work? The technical team tasked with developing practical shaped charge ammunition worked primarily at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Woolwich in London, though the concept was also pursued at other locations and through collaboration with American and Canadian research teams. What they needed to understand was that shaped charge ammunition works on a fundamentally different principle than conventional ballistics. Traditional anti-tank rounds relied on kinetic energy, the velocity and weight of a projectile striking armor and hoping to punch through by sheer force. A shaped charge round, by contrast, uses chemical energy concentrated into an extraordinarily narrow jet. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity, though diabolically complex to perfect. Picture a hollow-nosed projectile roughly the size and shape of a conventional bullet, perhaps 50 millimeters in diameter for the rounds used in rifles and light infantry weapons. The tip of this projectile contains a hollow cavity, and lining this cavity is a cone of copper, precisely shaped through careful pressing and machining. Surrounding the copper cone is the main explosive charge, carefully compressed to exact specifications. When the projectile strikes armor, a fuse initiates the explosive. The detonation wave travels through the explosive in a carefully calculated direction, not outward equally in all directions, but shaped so that it compresses the copper cone inward at tremendous velocity. The copper, being pushed inward from all directions simultaneously, undergoes a peculiar transformation. Instead of remaining solid, it liquefies under the pressure and accelerates backward down the axis of the cone, creating a hypervelocity jet of molten copper moving at speeds approaching 10,000 meters per second, roughly 30 times the speed of a conventional rifle bullet. This jet, no thicker than a pencil at some points, focuses tremendous force into a microscopic cross-sectional area, creating pressure that exceeds the yield strength of armor steel. The jet punches through the armor plate not by brute force, but by creating a stress condition that the steel cannot withstand. The armor literally parts before the jet, which tunnels through it like a hot needle through wax. Once the jet penetrates the armor, the consequences are typically catastrophic. The jet strikes fuel tanks, ammunition stowage, hydraulic systems, and human occupants in rapid succession. The secondary effects, the explosion of fuel and ammunition inside the tank, the fragmentation of the penetrated armor, the superheated gases expanding within the confined space, create conditions that are almost invariably fatal to everyone inside the vehicle. The manufacturing challenge was immense. The copper cone had to be shaped with precision tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The explosive charge had to be compressed uniformly around the cone, with no air gaps or irregularities that might distort the detonation wave. The fuse had to be reliable, initiating the charge at precisely the right moment on impact. The projectile body itself had to be strong enough to withstand the impact without deforming, which meant careful selection of steel alloys and manufacturing techniques. Early attempts produced unreliable results. Some rounds worked spectacularly, Others failed completely or performed inconsistently. The problem was that shaped charge effectiveness is extraordinarily sensitive to manufacturing tolerances. A deviation of a few millimeters in cone shape or explosive density could render a batch of ammunition nearly useless. British engineers solved these problems through systematic testing and iterative refinement. Production facilities were established at Royal Ordnance factories and contracted civilian manufacturers, who gradually achieved the consistency required. By 1943, production was ramping up significantly. The ammunition was incorporated into several platforms. Rifle grenades, essentially shaped charge warheads attached to special rifle grenades that could be fired from standard rifles. The projector, infantry, anti-tank, known as the PIAT, a spring-loaded weapon designed specifically to fire shaped charge projectiles, and in due course, tank-mounted guns were adapted to fire shaped charge ammunition as well. Production numbers are imprecise. Some records remain classified or have been lost, but estimates suggest that Britain manufactured millions of shaped charge rounds during 1943 and 1944 alone. These weapons consumed no strategic materials in critical shortage. Copper was produced in reasonable quantities, and the explosives were within Britain's manufacturing capacity. The first substantial combat deployment of shaped charge ammunition occurred in North Africa during early 1943. British infantry units equipped with rifle-fired shaped charge grenades encountered German and Italian armored vehicles in the fighting around Gafsa and Kasserine Pass. The results astounded soldiers and officers alike. Tanks that had seemed invulnerable could now be penetrated by a man with a rifle and the proper ammunition. One documented account from a British platoon sergeant describes engaging a German Panzer IV at approximately 200 meters. The initial shaped charge round struck the tank's flank and penetrated completely, causing an internal explosion. The tank brewed up in seconds. The sergeant's account emphasizes the psychological impact. After months of feeling helpless against German armor, British soldiers suddenly experienced a sense of power and control. As the war progressed into mainland Europe, shaped charge ammunition became a standard issue. Infantry platoons allocated shaped charge ammunition to their anti-tank specialists. The PIAT, though underpowered compared to contemporary American designs, was widely deployed and equipped with shaped charge warheads proved devastatingly effective. In Normandy and beyond, accounts abound of single infantrymen destroying tanks. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun, fitted with shaped charge ammunition, became a formidable weapon against even the heaviest German tanks. During the fighting in Normandy, PYAT teams operating with British and Canadian forces achieved confirmed kills against Panzer IVs, Panthers, and even occasional Tiger tanks, provided they could approach closely enough to achieve useful aim. The psychological impact on German forces cannot be overstated. From 1943 onwards, German tank crews knew that any infantry position they approached might contain shaped charge weapons. This knowledge altered tactical behavior fundamentally. Tanks became more reluctant to operate independently from supporting infantry. German infantry commanders were compelled to maintain more careful reconnaissance before committing armored vehicles. Defensive positions, which previously relied heavily on armored support, now required more robust anti-tank defenses because shaped charge ammunition was so portable and easy to distribute. It is important to acknowledge what records show and what remains speculative. Documentary evidence confirms shaped charge ammunition saw widespread operational use and achieved numerous confirmed tank kills. Letters, official reports, and accounts from survivors all testify to its effectiveness. However, precise numbers of tanks destroyed specifically by shaped charge ammunition remain uncertain. Records were not always kept with distinction between kills achieved by conventional anti-tank guns versus shaped charge weapons. Some accounts are exaggerated. The chaos of battle and the fog of war meant that soldiers did not always know what killed the vehicles they destroyed. If you are finding this interesting, A quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans, surprisingly, were slower to adopt shaped charge technology than the British, despite being first to develop tanks and anti-tank weaponry in general. German engineers were aware of the Monroe effect, but German doctrine emphasized tank-mounted guns and recoilless rifles more heavily than individual infantry anti-tank weapons. Germany did develop shaped charge ammunition, particularly the Panzerknacker and various anti-tank grenades, but these came later and were produced in smaller quantities. This represented a strategic miscalculation that benefited the Allies. German tanks, which had evolved along lines of superior firepower and protection, were not equally matched against enemies who could penetrate them at will with relatively simple infantry weapons. The American approach, interestingly, followed a different path. American forces developed the bazooka, a recoilless rocket launcher designed to fire shaped charge warheads. The bazooka, which entered service in 1942, was a revolutionary concept. The warhead itself provided the anti-tank effect, with no reliance on conventional kinetic energy. However, the early bazooka proved underpowered. The shaped charge warhead, approximately 37 millimeters in diameter, could not reliably penetrate the newest German tank armor. It was only when American forces adopted larger caliber versions and improved warheads that the bazooka became truly effective. The British chose to retrofit existing platforms. Rifles, anti-tank guns, and purpose-designed weapons like the PIAT with shaped charge ammunition rather than develop entirely new platforms. This approach had advantages and disadvantages. It was faster to implement as it worked with existing weapons and training, but the platforms themselves were sometimes less than ideal for delivering shaped charge warheads. In direct comparison, a British rifleman armed with shaped charge rifle grenades could penetrate contemporary German tank armor from perhaps 100 meters distance. An American soldier armed with an early bazooka could achieve similar results, but with more complex equipment and training requirements. A British PIAT operator could engage tanks out to approximately 100 meters effectively, though the weapon was slow to reload and uncomfortable to fire due to its spring-loading mechanism. An American soldier with a later improved bazooka had better range and faster rate of fire. The German response, the Panzer Faust, a cheap, disposable single-shot shaped charge weapon, would not see widespread distribution until 1944 and 1945. By which point the Allies had already secured air superiority and were driving rapidly toward final victory. The shaped charge principle, once proven and weaponized, spread rapidly. The Soviet Union, which had also developed anti-tank weapons independently, quickly adopted and adapted shaped charge technology. Soviet forces used shaped charge ammunition with their anti-tank rifles and in various handheld anti-tank weapons. Post-war, shaped charge ammunition became the standard for all anti-tank weapons across all nations. The fundamental principle proved too valuable, too effective, to remain limited to any single military tradition. Every modern handheld anti-tank weapon, the RPG, the Javelin, the NLAW, relies on shaped charge technology derived from the same engineering principles that British weapons designers perfected in 1943. The material impact of shaped charge ammunition was significant but perhaps less decisive than the conceptual impact. Shaped charge weapons certainly destroyed tanks. Documented cases provide sufficient evidence for that. But tanks continued to be built, continued to be used, and continued to dominate battlefields. What shaped charge ammunition actually accomplished was to democratize anti-tank capability. Before shaped charge technology, only specialized anti-tank guns, towed over difficult terrain by crews of 5 or more men, could reliably penetrate modern armor. After shaped charge technology, any infantryman carrying the proper ammunition possessed anti-tank capability. This fundamentally altered the equation of infantry versus armor. The psychological impact, by contrast, may have been more profound. Tank crews, accustomed to feeling relatively safe behind thick armor, suddenly understood that infantrymen posed a genuine threat. This shifted tactical doctrine across all combatant nations. Tanks became increasingly reluctant to operate without close infantry support, and defensive positions had to be organized with shaped charge threats in mind. German defensive doctrines in Normandy and the Low Countries were explicitly modified to account for the ubiquity of portable anti-tank weapons, which shaped charge ammunition made possible. The historical uncertainty lies primarily in assessing how decisively shaped charge weapons altered the course of the war. Certainly, they improved the tactical situation for the Allies. Certainly, they imposed costs on German operations. But did they prevent German victories that might otherwise have occurred? The evidence suggests probably not. The strategic situation was already heavily favorable to the Allies by the time shaped charge ammunition became widespread in 1943 and 1944. What shaped charge weapons did accomplish was to ensure that German success, even if temporarily achieved through offensive operations, could not be sustained against an enemy that could respond effectively to armored assault. The legacy of shaped charge technology extends far beyond the Second World War. Every modern anti-tank weapon, from the Soviet RPG-7, which saw first service in 1961 and remains in service today, through to modern systems like the Javelin and NLAW, relies fundamentally on shaped charge warheads. The principle has been refined, improved, and adapted, but the fundamental engineering remains unchanged. A modern Javelin warhead, which can penetrate any existing tank armor, operates according to the same principles that British engineers developed in 1943. The shaped charge technology has even spread beyond anti-tank weapons. Modern armor-piercing ammunition in general uses shaped charge principles, and the technology has applications in industrial cutting, mining, and surgical applications. The principle that seemed purely theoretical in 1888 became desperately practical in 1943 and has proven essential ever since. Physical surviving examples of early shaped charge ammunition are extremely rare. Most ammunition is expended in combat or training, and the ammunition itself tends to be recycled or destroyed during demilitarization. However, surviving examples can be found in military museums, particularly in Britain, Canada, and the United States. The Royal Armouries in Leeds, the Imperial War Museum in London, and the Canadian War Museum all possess examples of PIAT weapons and shaped charge ammunition. These physical objects, though small and unassuming, represent one of the most profound technical achievements of the war. Return to that moment in North Africa, March 15, 1943, when a British sergeant fired shaped charge ammunition through a German tank's flank. The shot itself was unremarkable, a moment among millions of moments during 6 years of global warfare. But what that moment represented was profound. It represented the moment when the apparent invulnerability of armored protection was shattered. It represented the moment when technical innovation, driven by desperation and necessity, transformed the relationship between infantry and armor. It represented the moment when engineers working in laboratories and factories across Britain took a principle from a scientific textbook and turned it into a weapon that changed warfare forever. The shaped charge ammunition that emerged from British development during 1942 and 1943 accomplished several things simultaneously. It provided the Allied armies with an answer to the tank threat that had haunted them since 1940. It enabled individual soldiers to possess anti-tank capability without requiring elaborate equipment or training. It improved morale among infantry forces by giving them a tool to strike back against armored enemies. It altered German tactical doctrine by forcing tank crews to accept that armor alone was no longer sufficient protection. And it established a technological principle that has endured for more than 80 years and shows no sign of becoming obsolete. Shaped charge ammunition represents a crucial moment in the evolution of military technology, the point at which defensive technology and offensive technology achieved a new equilibrium. For years, tanks had grown stronger, armor thicker, protection more elaborate. Anti-tank weapons had struggled to keep pace. Shaped charge technology provided a leap that broke the stalemate. It did not render tanks obsolete. Tanks remain central to military doctrine and capability to this day. But it ensured that tanks could never again dominate the battlefield unopposed by infantry carrying simple, portable, highly effective anti-tank weapons. That fundamental shift in the balance between infantry and armor persists today. Every modern infantryman who carries a modern anti-tank weapon carries the technological legacy of those British engineers working in 1943. Every tank crew who maintains watchful distance from potential infantry positions acknowledges the reality that shaped charge technology established. Armor alone is never sufficient. The innovation that emerged from British laboratories and factories during the darkest days of the Second World War proved not merely important for winning that conflict, but fundamental to how warfare would be waged for generations to come. It was, in the truest sense, a revolution in military affairs, not because it was complex or elaborate, but because it was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective.